introduction, I had a lot of jobs. I'm a family doctor, I'm a primary care doctor, but I'm also an addiction doctor, and I work in all kinds of different settings. I take care of brand new babies, and I take care of patients who are 104, and I take care of lots of people on the in-between. I'm the medical director at the jail. I'm the medical director of a drug and alcohol detox center. So you'll hear about some of the work we do as I'm speaking, but really we're going to spend time talking about the human brain, which is this unbelievable organ in our body. And I actually went to Yale for medical school, and when you go to Yale, you learn that the most important organ in the body is the kidneys, because they spend all their time on the kidneys, and the kidneys are awesome, I love the kidneys, but the brain is an extraordinary organ, and it is changing every minute of every day while your brain is young and growing. And at what age does your brain stop really developing?
26.
Yeah, 24, 25, 26. There's some stuff that may be still happening at the age of 35, but really, after 24 or 25, most of us are just declining a little bit, right? So you young people in the room have this extraordinary capacity to actually protect this extraordinary organ that is ensconced in your graphic in September of 2017 was called The Science of Addiction. And it's a great article, and Sarah told me this. You guys are going to take this slide deck, and any one of you can go give this slideshow next week. You don't have to give me credit, you can give it yourself, you can say you did the whole thing, I don't care. But I'm going to make a suggestion that you go back and you review a little bit of stuff ahead of time, including the video associated with this article or reading these articles, because it is complicated how the brain is impacted with all addiction. It is not a simple, single pathway, although I'm going to talk you through the pathway that is disrupted the most. But it's complicated, all the spots that are impacted with all addiction, whether it's gambling or sex or marijuana or nicotine, whatever the addiction is, the same part of the brain is impacted. This part of the brain is known as the reward circuit of the brain. It's the part of the brain that tells you to live or die every day. It tells you to find food, it tells you to find water, and it tells you to find a mate. Because this deep, elemental, ancient part of the brain is about surviving. It is about sending your genetic material forward and protecting the few generations ahead of you. At the end of the day, after the zombie apocalypse, this is what we're left with. This is what deep inside of us, all of us will be working towards. Now, most of us don't get up in the morning and think food, water, mate. Like, that's not the way most of us roll, right? But I'm telling you, at the most basic part, whether you're a cricket or koala or a human, this actually is what drives us. So here we are describing this most ancient elemental part of the brain, and racing through it is this neurotransmitter called dopamine. What does dopamine give to you? Yeah, it gives you joy, it gives you happiness, it gives you euphoria, it makes you feel awesome is what it does. It is the holy smokes, that was awesome, do it again chemical. That's what dopamine is in the brain. And when it comes to survival, your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents had dopamine racing through their brain in totally appropriate levels, and that is what allowed every one of us in this room to be here today, is because the behaviors associated with dopamine are really positive and are in keeping with great, healthy living. So this part of the brain with the dopamine has with it strong association of fine motor skills. It is one of the reasons why giving up the addiction to those little cancer sticks called cigarettes is so darn hard. Because you don't just miss the nicotine, you miss everything about the process. You touch the door handle on your car and you start to get cravings. You unwrap that little crinkly cellophane on the box, you tap down the box, you remove the cigarette, you light the lighter. The process itself is as addictive as the nicotine itself, because it has with it associated strong fine motor skills. There are two behaviors associated with dopamine racing through the reward center, and those behaviors are compulsion and perseveration. I have to do this thing, I am unable to stop thinking about this thing. And those two behaviors are fabulous, because your ancestors were good at them, right? They are less than fabulous when it comes to addiction. They actually define addiction. Compulsive use and unable to stop thinking about it, this perseveration defines addiction, right? So again, healthy behaviors in one way, really unhealthy behaviors when it comes to addiction. So dopamine is at the end cycle of all addiction, whether it's to a substance or any behavior. We can talk through the pathways of video game addiction, but at the end of the day, it impacts the dopamine reward circuit in the brain. So I make an argument that we all have a certain amount of dopamine in our brain. Now, there's no way to measure this. You're not going to call your family doctor tomorrow and ask for a serum level of dopamine because they will have no idea what you're talking about. When you look at PET scans or slices of people's brains, this is how you're able to measure dopamine. And I make an argument that we all have about 100 units of dopamine in our brain. That's the average. But some of us are these happy-go-lucky golden retrievers of the planet, right? And maybe our dopamine's like 108 because we just feel great every day. And some of us actually have just naturally lower dopamine, 85 or 90. I used to think I was a golden retriever, but I learned over the years I actually think I sit fairly low, and I do a lot of work every day to make myself feel happier. And for me, exercise is a huge part of increasing my dopamine. And my kids know this about me. They'll be like, Mom, you are so crabby. Have you exercised today? And I'm like, no, I haven't. I've got to get out the door because I'm losing my mind, right? Like I have to it takes me a lot more work to feel joy. So there's a range, maybe 85 to 108 of normal human dopamine levels in our brain. So this is the problem, is that when you were living on this planet 400 or 500 years ago, and you found the perfect food source, you just realized that the Connecticut River had a salmon spawn heading north, right? And you were like, holy smokes, I can go collect a few hundred salmon without a lot of work. I know how to preserve it. I can keep my entire village alive for like the next month and a half. What? You got a serious dopamine spike in your brain, because that is about keeping your generations alive. So you went from a dopamine baseline of 100, you get a dopamine spike to 150, and then it goes back to normal. You have sex, it's consensual, dopamine goes to 200, and then it goes back to normal. Because this is this, holy smokes, it is awesome, do it again, dopamine response in the brain that is consistent with surviving long term. You use a drug like cocaine and your dopamine will spike to about 350. You use a drug like a strong prescription opiate or heroin or fentanyl these days, and your dopamine will spike between 500, 900, even higher. I have no idea what the dopamine levels are with fentanyl, because why would anybody know that? Why would we start thinking that China would be shipping pounds of fentanyl to us? When you use a drug like crystal methamphetamine, your dopamine would go to 1,300. And what happens to the brain when it sees these levels is it becomes incredibly confused. So let's just remind ourselves about dopamine one more time. This is an equation in the brain, and this equation in the brain has to do with three things. How much dopamine is produced, how many little dopamine receptors are on the other side of the synaptic cleft receiving the information, and how many little vacuums are sucking dopamine out of the active part of the brain. There's three things. And every addictive behavior or substance is impacting one of these three things. Cocaine does only one thing, right? It does one thing. All cocaine does is turn off the vacuum, shuts down the vacuums, and that's how you build to a 350 level in the active part of the brain. All the opiates work in a more complicated way, because they go through a negative feedback loop through GABA, but at the end of the day, every opiate just produces more dopamine. So again, we could do this, we could spend all night walking the pathways, but you will be bored, and I will be bored too. So at the end of the day, everything that I'm describing is impacting the dopamine system somewhere in this equation. But when your brain starts to see these huge levels of dopamine, not in keeping with anything in the 200,000 years that we've been human, in the human form on this planet, when it sees a dopamine level of 350 or 900 or 1300, your brain's response to that is, holy smoke, something's wrong. There's something wrong with my brain. I need to quiet down the volume. I need to down-regulate. I need to stop making dopamine. I need to erase 80% of my dopamine receptors, and I need to turn on every single vacuum in sight. That's your brain's response to developing addiction. So when you have an addiction, you wake up in the morning and your new dopamine level isn't 100, isn't even a kind of a dismal 85. Your new dopamine set point when you get out of bed every morning is like a 40 or a 45. You're miserable. You are miserable not just because you have physiologic withdrawal, but you have levels of a chemical that is unbelievably necessary for survival. Your levels in your brain are so low that your brain is screaming at you. You feel terrible and you know how to fix this. You know how to fix this. You have this craving urge and this screaming voice that says this is not consistent with survival. In order for you to feel more normal, you have to continue the use. People who struggle with addiction aren't getting high anymore, right? They may get inebriated, but they're getting no joy out of it, right? They are constantly chasing, trying to feel normal. And it's a terrible way to live. I don't know who in this room is in recovery. I don't know who in this room loves or lives with somebody who struggles with addiction. It is an unrelenting disease. It is exhausting. And the most important thing we can do as society is to prevent it, right? Treating it's hard. I treat it all day long, and I struggle with treating it all day long. If I can prevent it in a group of younger people in this room, if we could prevent the disease of addiction, it actually is an unbelievably preventable disease, that is a much better outcome. And more time and money and effort, organizations like what you guys have, this really well-organized organization here in Windsor, their efforts are in prevention. And we need to start funding prevention, because prevention pays for itself by 100-fold. So this leads to this concept of the broken brain. Now, we could have walked through every other disease state, every other chronic disease, and I could have talked to you about what transmitters, chemical transmitters got disrupted, right? Diabetes looks like this, cardiovascular disease looks like this, kidney disease, like every disease looks like this, quite honestly. It's not any different. The problem is what happens at the local hospital. So don't get me wrong, don't think I'm throwing, I don't know, Hartford Hospital under the bus. I'm not. I can do this with every hospital. But I want to talk to you about this guy who lives in Windsor, okay? He's a 68-year-old guy. And he's having crushing substernal chest pain, sort of clutching at his chest. And his wife looks at him and says, honey, you don't look so good. And he's like, no, I'm all good. It's all good. It was something I ate for lunch. And she's like, I'm calling 911, okay? So she calls 911. In a town like Windsor, we got police, fire, EMS is there. Like, they're there in 3 minutes. They're all crowding into the living room. And they look at him, and they're like, you look like you're having a heart attack. So they give him a sublingual nitroglycerin, and they give him some oxygen, and they can chew a baby aspirin, they give him a beta blocker, they put in a big bore IV, they hang some morphine because he's having so much pain. And they transmit that EKG to Hartford. And Hartford says, get him here fast. We're going to warm up the cath lab, but then they say, forget the cath lab, right? We're not going to cath this guy. This guy needs bypass surgery. They have him in the operating room in less than an hour, and he ends up in quadruple bypass surgery. He's on the cardiac care floor in the ICU for about another week. He's on the telemetry floor for about another week. He gets depressed, because guys, after they get their first heart attack, get really depressed. He has a new cardiologist, a new primary care doctor, a new therapist. He gets to go to cardiac rehab for 12 weeks. How much money would you spend on him? Somebody just said 300, so maybe $250,000 or $300,000. That's about what we just spent on this guy, because that's a lot. What I just described is actually a tremendous amount, okay? His next door neighbor in Windsor, is right smack dab next to him, is this 24-year-old girl. She graduated from high school and got a college scholarship to play soccer. And at the age of 19, she had a massive tear in her ACL playing soccer, and actually lost her athletic scholarship and had to have big knee surgery, and was pretty depressed. And she's been somebody who struggled with anxiety and depression when she was a teenager as well. So after the surgery, she got exposed to oxycodone for the first time. She realized it made her feel way better, like better than she had ever felt. In fact, she would say, my depression got better, my anxiety went away, I felt awesome. So she used and overused and misused and kept going back for more and more scripts for several months before that orthopedist cut her off. But by that time, she was buying pills on the street. And then within about a year, she realized she couldn't afford the pills anymore, so she converted to street heroin. And for the last 4 years, she's been using heroin. She's 24 years old, but for the last 9 months, she's been doing really, really well. She left the bad neighborhood. She left the bad boyfriend who was leading her down a bad path. She moved back home with her parents in Windsor. She's going to meetings. She goes to a Suboxone clinic. She's a new therapist. She's getting rehab for her knee. She's exercising again. She's building her dopamine back up in her brain. She just got a job. First time she's had a job in forever. She's working at Dunkin' Donuts, started a month ago, and she got her first paycheck last week. Feeling great. So when her mom knocks on the bathroom door this morning and finds that the door is locked and there's no response behind it, her mom gets a massive adrenaline rush. She kicks the door down and finds her daughter lying on the ground, blue and not breathing. That mom calls 911 first, because always you activate the emergency response system, starts performing CPR, and administers the drug overdose drug known as Narcan, but also naloxone, but her daughter doesn't start breathing again. And by this time, patrol cars and fire have arrived, and they have Narcan too. And they administer 4 vials of Narcan to this 24-year-old girl before she comes back to breathing again. They transport her to Hartford Hospital emergency room. And what do we do for her there?
Give her an IV.
Somebody says we just release her. Somebody says maybe we give her an IV. She'd have to be pretty sick to get an IV. She'd have to be vomiting, have vital sign changes. So I bet she doesn't even buy an IV. I don't she doesn't even warrant that much. Probably should just get sent out. What'd you say?
They don't send you to a location to get help. They don't send you for rehab. They just send you.
So right in the front row, second row here, they don't send you to a place where they can get help. They don't give you any more resources. They basically send you back home. And that's what happens to her. She's kicked to the curb. So let me tell you about my 68-year-old, her next door neighbor, a little bit more, okay? Both of his parents had massive cardiovascular disease. His dad dropped dead of a heart attack at the age of 57, and his mom had a massive stroke at his exact age 68, ended up in the neurosurgical ICU for 2 weeks before she died. He smokes about a pack and a half a day of cigarettes, kicks back about a 12-pack of beer every day, and he is a fast food junkie. McDonald's is his first choice. He tries to go there 3 to 4 times a week, but his wife sometimes finds out, so he has to curtail that one a little bit. Does this guy have addiction? What's he addicted to? Food, salt, sugar, fat, absolutely. What else? Nicotine. He's addicted to tobacco. Yep, what else? Yeah, you can't kick back a 12-pack of beer every day and not be an alcoholic. You can't convince me of that one. So yeah, this guy's an addict, right? Seriously, like he's an addict, right? Did anybody roll into his living room and be like, you know what, dude? You're an addict, right? You're going to cost me a whole bunch of money for a disease that could have been prevented. Did this guy create his heart attack? He did actually. I'll give him the genetic risk. I'll give him a little bit of the genetic risk, but I didn't tell you, but both of his parents were smokers too. And if I couldn't have gotten rid of the tobacco in that family, nobody would have had early heart attacks, right? This guy created a disease in his body that cost us, the state, basically, because this guy's on Medicare. It just cost us $250,000, right? And did anybody roll into his living room or in the emergency room at Hartford Hospital or in the telemetry floor say, you know what? You're a piece of trash, right? Why did we just drop $250,000 on you when you created your disease because you're an addict? Nobody did that because it's not what we do in this country, actually. We provide medical care, theoretically some of the best, certainly the most expensive medical care in the world to all comers, right? I'm a primary care doctor. I take care of people who are not doing great, right? I take care of people who are massively overweight, who stop taking their insulin, who forget to tell me they really haven't bothered to pick up their blood pressure medicine. My job is to take care of people who struggle with chronic disease and to help make little tiny changes. I don't have the expectation that my people are all going to become vegan marathon runners, right? I sit there with people and say, what do you think's reasonable? You have told me you're not comfortable in your body right now. What could change for you? And they say, I could start walking. And I'm like, okay, that's a goal. So let's talk that through. How many minutes might you be able to walk? And tell me when you'll fit that in the day. Who might walk with you? Because you're more likely to go outside and walk if you have somebody waiting for you. Little, tiny, incremental changes. That's what my goal is during the day, right? Nobody's ever going to make a TV show about primary care because we're not sexy, right? We make small changes to help improve people's quality of life. And the reason I do this work is because I find the fact that we treated these two human beings so differently. I find it appalling, right? It ticks me off to no end that we treat people who struggle with addiction, whether it's to opiates, to alcohol, or any other addiction, we make them feel terrible, and we provide no real medical care. This girl didn't need to get admitted. She actually didn't need anything. You know what she needed? She needed somebody to sit with her and look her in the eyeball and say, you know what, love? You've been doing great for 9 months. 9 months you were doing well, right? And guess what happens? Between 6 and 13 months, high relapse time. Because you know what? People start to feel better. They start to feel more normal. I told you this story in a very typical way. She feels better. She feels more confident. She just got her first job. She just got her first paycheck. This is a very classic time where people are going to dip in their toe, right? And with opiates, there's no toe dipping going on. Once you restart, the likelihood of you dying is incredibly high. Relapse is common, yet it's more and more dangerous the more time you've had away from the drug. So is this what I would have done or what you would have done in the ER is just say, we just need to get you a little bit more stuff coming your way. We need 5 people you could call before this happens. You actually don't get to control your own money. You're not there yet. Someday you will, but right now your money's getting direct deposited into an account that only your mom controls, and you get $2 a day for coffee. Because that was part of her relapse, right? We didn't need to spend any money to help this young woman. We needed to make sure she got right back into her Suboxone provider, call her therapist right away, get her right back to a meeting, like begin to do risk management strategies. That's all I'm asking, right? That's all that needed to happen, yet instead we made her feel worse than she already felt. You think she doesn't feel like a piece of trash already? You think she doesn't feel like she let down? Her mom had to see her daughter dead on the floor. You think she doesn't feel bad enough, really? So that's a long time for me to talk about one slide. But I'm telling you, this is one of the most important public shifts that we have to make. And you know what's going to make this shift? This room. This room. This room already has. The slowest change agents on this issue nationwide has been hospitals and doctors. They have been the slowest to respond. And who in this room works in a hospital or a medical field? Some people do. Maybe you'll disagree with me about this, but I work in a hospital. I'm the chair of the Department of Medicine. And in general, hospitals have not been fast moving on this. They have not said, wow, we created this crisis, because guess what we did, right? We all need to get way better at treating people with addiction, and we need to go back and learn more about the subject and actually do our jobs. I'm a family doctor. You know what my specialty is? Pregnancy and babies. But 8 years ago, I became a specialist in addiction because there was no one else doing it. It had to happen. Okay, let's go back to dopamine. These are slices, PET scans of the brain. And what you see, that orange stuff in the middle brain, that's dopamine racing through that part of the brain. So those are healthy brains. That stack in the middle column are nice, healthy brains with normal amounts of dopamine racing through. And the stack of brains that are over on the right of the screen, those are brains of people struggling with addiction. The top one is cocaine, and the next one down is crystal meth. The third one down is alcohol, and the final one is opiates. I like this slide because I want you to look at the brain with alcohol use disorder. There's still a surprising amount of orange or dopamine on that brain. And I want to remind us that alcohol is an incredibly harmful drug in society. It's legal. There are liquor stores everywhere. And the wheels come off the alcohol bus pretty late in the game. There are a lot of us who are functional alcoholics. 13% of Americans are actually considered alcoholics. That is a huge number. They do not walk into my office and say, wow, I think I'm struggling with alcohol. Can you help me? That has never happened to me in 20 years of practice, right? Sometimes I claw it out of them, right? It's not easy to figure out. But sometimes I get that admission and I say, well, let's work on this together. But it takes a while before your wife walks out on you, you get your second OUI, and you lose your job, right? Because that's the point where people walk in and are like, I think I need some help. So let's talk about what puts people at risk for addiction. There's 3 things that are going to predispose you to addiction. The first one is genetic predisposition. The second one is early exposure while your brain is developing. And the third one is growing up in a chaotic, traumatic household. Having poor mental health as a teenager does not mean that you're going to struggle with addiction. Actually, having poor mental health is actually a subcomponent of all these other things. The problem is that when you're 14 years old and you have terrible anxiety or depression, and you realize that when I drink alcohol, I'm the life of the party. When I drink alcohol, I feel like I'm funny, I'm more confident, I feel like I have friends. Then what you are is a kid who's self-medicating for anxiety with a drug, consequently exposing the brain while it's still developing. So it isn't that the mental health disorder created the addiction, it was sort of an unintended consequence of the anxiety. And it's why, as adults, when our teenagers are struggling with anxiety and depression, we have got to be all over that and be like, okay, we've got to get you some therapy, we've got to get you more physical exercise, we've got to get your life to have a little bit more joy or dopamine in it. And for some of us, we need to be on medicine, even as teenagers, to help, because you don't want your kids self-medicating, right? Because the self-medicating drugs out there in general are quite harmful. So the genetics of addiction are some of the strongest genetics we know in medicine. It's actually hard to find more strongly associated genetic disorders. So if you have a parent or a grandparent who struggles with addiction, you have about a 50% chance of developing addiction yourself. So who needs to hear that? Yeah, your kids actually need to hear that. And I think that's actually terrifying for parents. I think that's a terrifying thought, that you would tell your kids that they're at risk for disease. Because you think to yourself, that's not fair, right? That's not fair. You get what you get. You don't get to choose your parents or your grandparents. We all got our own genetic mix. It's just handed to us, right? But I'm telling you, the reason you tell your kids this, the reason our kids deserve to know what their genetic risk is they get to do something that I'm about to show you on the next slide that changes everything. Because if they can do the next thing well, they actually almost entirely erase the genetic risk, okay? All addiction is considered a developmental pediatric disease. Addiction starts while the brain is developing. If you can get to the age of 23 or 24 not having used an addictive substance, the likelihood of developing addiction is 1%. If you have a strong genetic risk working against you, because we do the studies looking at people without genetic risk and those with genetic risk, the likelihood of developing addiction by the age of 23 or 24, having not used anything, is only 5%, right? So you don't entirely erase your genetics, but you come really darn close to erasing your entire genetics just by delaying your use. That's all I'm asking my kids to do, is just delay their use. That's it. So when you sit with somebody who struggles with addiction and you ask the question, how old were you with your first exposure? Was it alcohol, marijuana, or nicotine? Those are my 3 common. These days, the first start drug right now is pot. That's the #1 first start drug. Newsweek yesterday came out with the article saying, yep, there it is. We've been waiting for that to happen. And we're going to show you some slides that look at that. So this is the question I ask people. What's the average age of first start? Yeah, you guys just covered it. It's 12, 13, or 14 is the average age of first start. Now that is a 12, that is a 6th grader. That is 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. So having the conversation for the first time, either in school or in some other setting at 10th grade, what? Horse is so far out of that barn. This kind of conversation starts in the 5th and 6th grade, right? You're not talking about the details of some stuff, but you're talking about vaping and nicotine and alcohol consumption and all this stuff, really, when the kids are 10, 11, and 12. That is not too early. You would tell a 5-year-old, if you ever find a pill on the ground, you get an adult. 100% of the time, you never pick up the pill, ever, you get an adult. Because a little tiny calcium channel blocker that I might use for blood pressure will kill a 5-year-old, right? They don't know that. They don't know what it is. Iron is a very dangerous drug to a little tiny kid. So that is a drug message you would give to a kindergartner, right? So my point is you can make it all very age appropriate. So when you're 15 years old and you start drinking, and drinking here is defined as 2 alcoholic beverages a week, 40% of those 15-year-olds go on to be alcoholics. And if you wait until the age of 21, 7% go on to be alcoholics. Right? 15 to 21. Just in your mind, think about your 15-year-olds and think about your 21-year-olds. I have that age right now in my life. They're really different people, quite honestly, right? And when it comes to brain development and exposure to toxins that actually change the way the brain develops, it's all about postponing use. I don't look at my kids and say, don't ever drink, it's going to kill you, and stand there with my glass of wine and say that, right? I just say, while your brain is developing, you need to really actually avoid addictive substances because they are harmful while your brain is developing. And once your brain is fully developed, you can drink in moderation. I never tell them to smoke cigarettes because I hate cigarettes, right? But you could choose to use marijuana at a later age in moderation if that's your choice. But while your brain is developing, you need not to be doing that. So let's talk about our kids, because the truth about our kids is our kids, this generation right here, is actually making the best health decisions that we have seen in 40 years, and they get no credit for it. This generation of young people in this room are going to eradicate paper cigarettes. They are going to erase it. What do you guys think about cigarettes? Any one of you? What was that? Ew, right? She said yuck, I think, first, and then her second one was ew. That is a classic, and I love it. Most often I hear disgusting or gross, so that is perfect. And that's what this generation in general thinks about paper cigarettes. They're disgusted by them. Do you remember when these guys were little toddlers in the car, and they're like, Mommy, somebody's smoking? Right? Remember, they were horrified, and you were embarrassed because they were acting like that person needed to be arrested, and you're like, it's not illegal to eat squirrel, it's just not good for their health, but do you remember that, right? Because this generation has really heard the public messages about how bad, how harmful nicotine is, right? So this is the problem. As the sense of harm with cigarettes has gone up, use has plummeted. Really? This generation will eradicate it. I'm going to tell you about the giant exception to everything I just said in a minute. But the use of marijuana, as the sense of harm with marijuana has gone way, way down, the use is way up. So let's talk about what young people might say about marijuana. It's a plant, it's organic, it's natural, it grows in the ground, no big deal. Better than the pharmaceutical industry. What else?
Everyone's doing it.
Everyone does it. Everybody I know does it. Everybody. It helps me. It helps me study. I'm better in class. I'm a better athlete when I'm high. I get that. And that one, I'm always like, I try not to laugh in people's faces, but I'm like, seriously, what sport involves slow reflexes? Nothing, right? But you hear that one too. Okay, what else?
It's not addictive.
It's not addictive. You can't get addicted to it. What else?
It's less worse than alcohol.
They always compare it to alcohol. It's not as bad as alcohol. They want to very strongly believe alcohol is a harmful drug. It is sold, we tax it, it is on liquor stores everywhere, and it ticks kids off and young people off that alcohol is so available, marijuana is not. Always a comparison there. What else?
It's becoming legal.
It's becoming legal. So in Massachusetts, all of, 20 minutes from you guys, as of July 1, the first recreational pot stores will be open, and they'll be open in Springfield. They're right across the border. And in Connecticut, you guys have medical marijuana, right? So not legal in Connecticut now, and from what I understand, the legislative stuff here doesn't feel to me like it's on a wicked fast track, but I'm telling you, legislators who think this is about taxing and raising revenue are pretty on board. Okay, you guys covered it. This was the smartest young people response to pot I've ever had. You nailed every one of those. Okay, so let's talk about it. Okay, brain development. So everybody knows you're born, you have this ginormous head, and your brain is as big as it's ever going to be by age 2. It doesn't get any bigger than that. As a mom who delivered a baby, that head is huge and horrifying, right? So your brain is going through massive changes, but between the ages of 12 and 24, 3 very specific things happen, okay? The first one is something called synaptic refinement. You have tens of billions, you may even have hundreds of billions of little tiny electrical impulses in your brain. And that's normal, it's supposed to be that way. At the age of 9 and 12, your brain is a hot, tangled mess of these neurons. And what must happen between the ages of 12 and 24 is you need to prune it back, you need to cut it back, you need to get rid of a huge percent of this stuff. That seems crazy that you want to lose stuff in your brain, but at this age, adolescents, that's their job. Their job, unbeknownst to them, is to get rid of stuff they don't need and hold on to pathways they do need. During adolescence, our kids are losing 30,000 synapses a second at certain times during development. Now, it's not happening every minute of every day. There are phases they go through. If you do not do this successfully, you end up with a terribly tangled, messy, mentally ill brain. We actually think people with advanced psychosis or schizophrenia have brains that look more like this. So this is critical. It has to happen, right? The second thing that happens during the same age is something called myelination, or it's sheathing rapid pathways in the brain. It's about turning gray matter to white matter. This is the stage it happens. And this makes little dusty country roads in the brain super highways. So it allows our kids to develop good, fast decision making. This is one of the only times it happens, okay? So our kids' brains are fabulous and spectacular, and as a parent of 3 teenagers, slightly horrifying at times, right? But this is normal, right? Our brains of our teenagers are supposed to be doing this. They tend to have less consideration for negative consequences. There tends to be less than optimal planning. There tends to be more risky, impulsive behaviors, less consideration for negative consequences. I covered that. Emotions are felt very widely. I have 2 teenage girls at home. Holy smokes, not to be discriminatory or genderizing here, but I'm telling you, those teenage girls, that emotional spectrum is insane. It just is insane, right? You are incredibly influenced by your peers when you're a teenager. There's this very strong hypersensitivity towards social exclusion. You're never like that the rest of your life. When you were in 2nd grade and you were sitting by yourself at the lunch table, you're like sitting there peeling apart your bologna sandwich and making a paper hat out of a napkin. You really didn't care. And when you're 27 and you're sitting by yourself in some cafeteria, you actually don't really care either, right? You're reading your New York Times on your smartphone. You don't care. But when you're 13 and 15 and 16, sitting by yourself in a cafeteria, you're spending that entire time thinking like, nobody likes me. Do I look stupid? Do I have something on my face? Where are my friends? Why isn't she talking? You have this crazy, negative self-talk racing through your brain. Even if you're the smartest kid, the most popular kid, the best athlete, every kid experiences it. This is normal teenage development. And it's the reason why most adults would never go back and relive middle school or high school. We wouldn't. Now, I would go back at my age now, right? Go back to middle school, kick some butt. That's what I would do, and that's what everybody else would do. But that's not what we would get to do. We'd have to go back and relive it the way that these guys have to live it. It's not easy. Because that mirror in your head, that self-mirror, is not a happy place to be. And there's nothing wrong with this brain. Again, it is doing what it needs to do, but it's the reason why our kids, it's very easy for them, even though they know that what is being offered to them, the bowl of pot, isn't what they should be doing, even though they know their mom is going to be really upset if she ever finds out. This hypersensitivity to social exclusion is so intense, it just is so intense, that their instinct is, I'm in. Yes, I'm in, right? The influence of peers is huge, and it is why knowing who your kids' friends are, it really matters. Okay, so there's a third thing that happens in brain development, and that is that we lay down the final shell of our brain, the final cortex. All those dopamine receptors at the end get laid down. And you guys already know about how dopamine gets broken with addiction. It is the reason why all addiction is a developmental pediatric disease. It has to do with the laydown of dopamine. There's a second receptor that is active at this stage of the game called anandamide. And we think anandamide is partly in charge of what gets pruned, cut away, and what gets kept. This is the problem, ready? Anandamide is a naturally occurring neuroendocannabinoid. Woo, that's a long syllabic word there. It is the mirror image of THC, which is the psychoactive cannabinoid in marijuana. And your brain actually can't tell those two things apart. It cannot tell apart your naturally occurring anandamide that's in charge of pruning back your brain. It can't tell it apart from THC. But most upsettingly, THC is much more potent than anandamide. THC is like using a sledgehammer to decide what gets kept in your brain and what gets pruned. And anandamide, this thing that's been around for 200,000 years, that looks just like THC, is like using a surgical scalpel. So what somebody does over the age of 25 in the privacy of their own home with marijuana, I actually don't really care. I don't want you on my roads. I don't want you babysitting my kids. I don't want you operating on my knee. I did not vote for it to be legalized in Massachusetts because I know what's really going to happen to this industry. But over the age of 25, after your brain is fully developed, I actually don't think it's worse than alcohol. I don't, right? But while your brain is developing, marijuana is a neurotoxic drug to develop your brain. There's no way you can convince me otherwise. It just is. And if your job out in this room, if everybody in this room's job was to work for the marijuana industry, right, and to make sure they sold a lot of product and made a lot of money, who's your target audience? Yeah. All addiction starts while the brain is developing, period. So always, when your job is to sell an addictive substance, you have got to get the kids on board. You think I'm their market, right? I'm 50 years old. I am not their market. They have no interest in capturing me. I will make them no money. They're going after you and you and you, period. That's the way this industry is designed. And that is the reason I did not support making it legal, right? Do I certify people for medical marijuana? Of course I do, right? Under certain qualifications, absolutely. I think it helps some people some of the time. But it is being billed, if you Google it, the first 900 pages on Google are all pro-pot and all the positive stuff it could do. So let's just dive in a little bit more. What do we know? We know that it impacts attention, verbal learning, memory, processing speed, and that stuff stays even when you're not high. This is what's called the Christchurch Study. It studied 1,200 people. And I'm going to compare the two extremes just to make the really strong point, okay? So this followed people for over a period of 25 years. And now I'm going to compare people who used marijuana 0 times between the ages of 14 and 21. So adolescent use, 0 times. And I'm going to compare it to people who used marijuana 400 times or more, same span of time, 14 to 21, okay? 400 uses of marijuana in a 7-year span, that's actually not that much. I'm talking a couple times a week. I'm not even talking heavy daily use here, okay? Graduated from college by age 25. The kids who used marijuana 0 times graduated 36% of the time. The kids who used marijuana 400 times or more graduated 2% of the time. When you look at unemployment rates by age 25, unemployment for the kids who used 0 times was 21%. The kids who used 400 times or more, unemployment 52%. And this is New Zealand, so the social welfare system is really robust. But when you look at the people who used 400 times or more, 57% of them were in public assistance. That for me is just a failure to launch, right? That is my kid never leaving my house, never getting a job, like hanging out in my basement. I'm not okay. I love my kids. I want them out of my house. I want them to pay taxes, give back to society. That's their job. My job is to allow them the experience and freedom to do that. So when you look at the other well-known study, which is known as the Dunedin Study out of Australia, it shows an 8-point drop in IQ by the age of 35 for the kids who used marijuana as teenagers versus the kids who didn't. But the problem with every study out there is it's based on the old pot. It's based on marijuana with a THC of 3% or less, because that is all we had available before the year 1995. Today's field-grown marijuana is sitting between 9% and 16% THC. That's the stuff that grows in the fields of the Connecticut River Valley, okay? And this is what our kids know when I say the word pot. They know the concentrate. So this is the plant that has had butane or another volatile agent forced through it, so the THC is extracted. So this is shatter and butter and earwax and hash oil, and this is sitting between 50 and 90% THC. So you think your brain is better at 70% THC exposure? You think you're building your IQ? You think you're more likely to graduate from college? We are basing everything we know about marijuana on on a drug that doesn't even exist anymore, right? This is like me comparing Tylenol to fentanyl, right? That is where we are. These are not even the same drugs anymore, and we know nothing. We know nothing about this substance. Yet we're saying, no, it's all good. It's no problem. Seriously, we got this. So our kids know this, but there are a gazillion ways to get pot into your body. You can smoke it, you can bake it, you can rub it on your skin in a cream, you can put it under your tongue as a tincture, you can have it in spaghetti sauce and beer and milk, and cook it in a brownie, 1,000 different ways to use it. There are a million recipes on the internet. But if you're the industry trying to hook your kids, this is the way you'll sell it, right? You will sell it in candy form, mix it with fat and sugar, and you'll make it look just like any other candy bar your kid would want, right? The Lookalikes. So this is the product that comes straight out of Colorado. This was a few years ago, but we sent a delegation from Massachusetts to Colorado, and it was like state legislators and state police. And it was actually one of the state police who brought these back, and I was hanging out with him in an auditorium. And he was such a funny guy. He actually passed these things around. I don't know what he was thinking, because he had the real stuff. And I was like, dude, you're never going to get that back. Like, what are you doing? So literally, coming back up front, there was like 10% of this stuff.
This is real.
This is all real stuff.
You can buy this stuff in the store?
Yeah, anywhere in Colorado. So this stuff, every one of those candy bars, that Kit Kat, has 12 servings in it. So the last time you guys took a Kit Kat and broke it into 12 little pieces and ate one piece, and then put the 11 pieces back into that little wrapper and say, I will save you for later. You've never done that, because why? You would never do that, because that's insane. And the THC in this was between 70 and 80%. Incredibly potent products, really mislabeled, like really confusingly labeled. So Colorado, since this, has now changed their rules so that you can't do direct lookalikes anymore. You can't have Oreos and Kit Kats. In Massachusetts, I'm not giving Massachusetts any credit, because we have not done a great job. They say no lookalike candies either, and you can't do gummy animals. No gummy worms, no gummy bears. But you could do gummy cubes and squares, like you can do other things, right? So they're trying to have it be a little less liked by kids. But the truth is, this stuff is all about marketing to our kids. That's what we will do. I want you guys to take a trip, a little field trip, for those of you over 21 to Massachusetts, because you got to know what's out there. Again, they don't open until July 1. So, is marijuana addictive, which is what one of you said? The kids think it's not addictive. Now, we used to say that the most addictive substance we knew was nicotine, right? If I gave everybody a cigarette in this room, 32% of you would get addicted, like basically right away. You'd be hooked, right? That used to be the most addictive substance we knew. So we used to say the rates of addiction to pot were much lower. They were like 9%. So the problem is when you're a teenager, the rates of addiction are maybe 17%. But when you start with today's pot, right? I'm talking about the old weed. Now I'm talking about today's pot. The rates of addiction with marijuana starting as a teenager is between 30 and 50%, which means it's more addictive than nicotine. That's what we just passed in Massachusetts, right? 20 minutes away from you guys, I'm going to have a substance that is intentionally going to be trying to hook your kid, and it's more addictive than nicotine. I'm going to skip this article because everybody's going to get the slide deck and you're going to go back and read it. But this just compares marijuana to the tobacco industry, because haven't we ever learned any lessons from our 120 years of the tobacco industry? The #1 killer in our country, by a long shot, is tobacco. 500,000 Americans die every day from tobacco. Every year from tobacco. And you would think that we have learned something, but it appears we have learned nothing on this subject. Okay, so let's move to alcohol for a second. It's going to feel like a rapid shift to you, but I will not underplay the role that alcohol plays in our society, because it plays a big role. I do not deny that. 1/3 of us in this country drink nothing, 0. 1/3 of us in this country drink very lightly, like a drink a week, a couple drinks a month, extremely light social drinkers. The final 1/3 of us drink everything else, everything. And in fact, the final 10% of us drink on average 10 drinks a day. It's a pretty big number, 10 drinks a day, right? Most people drinking 10 drinks a day probably aren't here. Because to have gotten 10 drinks in you, you're probably starting already, right? But these are people you and I work with. They're people you and I live with. Because it doesn't take much to get to 10 drinks a day, and I want to remind us about this. A beer is a 12-ounce, 5% beer, so that's one drink. So if you're drinking a 16-ounce really hoppy ale, actually do the math, it actually adds up to 2 beers pretty fast. Hard alcohol is 1.5 ounces, and for those of us who are bartenders in the room, when you're mixing a drink, you're actually mixing multiples of that. So a cocktail actually could be equivalent to 2 or 3 drinks, and so when you're having a couple of cocktails, you just got yourself to 6. Right? And this is the real issue. Every day I take care of people, and I always say, tell me about your relationship to alcohol. That's how I ask the question. And my women will say, oh, you know, I have a couple glasses at night. I'm like, oh yeah, what are you drinking? And they're like, you know, I have wine. I'm like, how much are you drinking? I drink a wine glass, right? And they do this like hand motion of some giant, huge goblet, right? Because this is very normal behavior in certain socioeconomic situations of this kind of thing. Targeting women, targeting hardworking moms, come home after a terrible day at work and you want to transition to your home life and you immediately uncork a bottle of wine. And what our kids see with this, when we walk in the door after a terrible day at work, right? And immediately what we do is uncork a bottle of wine or flip the top of a beer bottle. The message you send to your kids is, wow, when you're stressed out, when you're overworked, when you're tired, when you're angry, if you drink, you're better, right? I should drink, that's the message. And more of us need to walk in after a terrible day and be like, man, I've had a bad day. I need to go for a walk. Anybody want to walk the dog with me? I'm headed out. I'm going to go lay down my yoga mat in the living room, and I'm going to hit my John Kabat-Zinn meditation thing, 10 minutes, that's it, on my phone, and I'm going to go calm my brain down because I'm clearly a hot mess, right? We need to model as adults healthier ways of managing our own stress and unhappiness. That's what we need to do as adults. Think about the last time you guys were at an adult party where alcohol wasn't really prominent. It really is very prominent in many, many settings. And I think we need to shift that. I don't think it's a positive message. So people say this one to me all the time. They're always like, oh, I want to train my kid to drink. I want to have my kid go to college knowing how to drink. And I look at them and I'm like, there's no way to train your kid to drink. You're dealing with an adolescent developing brain here. Having them exposed early under your watch in your own house, you're not doing them any favors. And the studies support this, right? You expose your kid at the age of 17 or 18, all you've done is create somebody who's going to drink more. So don't think you're doing anybody any favors by collecting keys and hosting the party. First of all, it's illegal, period, right? It is against the law to supply alcohol to an underage individual. So you're doing nobody any favors. And again, you may think you're keeping these kids off the road. The real message is just delay your use, right? And ask your kids. You know, my daughter went to the prom, and I looked at her and I said, what's your after-prom plan? And she's like, well, we thought about going to a party. And I said, well, what are you thinking about that? She said, I think probably, one, you won't let me. Two, I don't think I'm going to have a party out there where alcohol and pot's not available. And so I think I probably don't need to go to that. I'm like, good thinking, right? She talked herself through it, but I knew she felt sort of pressured from me. But after whatever parties tend to have substances involved. And they're often hosted by families. It's not okay. My alcohol, ready for this? I came home, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago with my little drill set and my Home Depot walk, and I locked up all my alcohol. And my kids, my oldest was maybe 13 at the time, and he's like, Mom, what is up? Like, what are you doing? I was like, locking up all the alcohol in the house. He said, you don't trust me? And I was like, nope. Right, 13 years old. Average age of first start's 12. Why would I have it readily available? I went to high school in the 1980s. I know what we did to our parents' liquor cabinets. Right, seriously. I do not want to be the house where other kids or my own kids have access to liquor. Why would I do that? You know what it did in my house? It made us all drink a lot less. My husband and I just drink a lot less because it's a pain in the neck. He often looks at me, he's like, I don't remember the code. And I'm like, yeah, like, it's okay, maybe it's have a glass of water instead. So my point is, don't be that house. Don't be the house that becomes an easy place where other kids can get high. It's not okay. So this is the other thing that parents will say to me in a room like this. They'll be like, oh, but in Europe they drink all the time. They start drinking really early and they're fine in Europe. Nobody's addicted in Europe. And I'm like, oh, I don't think that's true. And so look it up. The first 25 countries in the entire world with the highest addiction rate, they're all in Europe, Eastern or Western, period. Number 13 is Seoul, Korea, and number 25 is South Africa. Every other country there is European, every single one. Okay, so just don't, again, this is about early exposure. That's what this is about. Again, you're going to get the slide deck. Everybody's going to get it who signed up for it. And you're going to go home and study up because you're going to do your talk next week, okay? So I'm not going to go into the gory details on this one, but who knows about the ACE score in this room? Okay, so I have people in the room who do public health works, social work teacher, counseling, school counseling, you're a prevention person. So the ACE score is a study that came out in the year 1998. And it was a study out of Kaiser San Diego. And what it did is it asked 10 questions to an adult reflecting upon what might have happened to them under the age of 18 in their household, okay? I'm not going to read the whole survey. I actually often read it, but I have younger people in the room. You're going to go back and look at it. 10 questions, yes or no. And they're questions about bad stuff that happened to you in your house, like Were your parents too drunk or too high to take you to the doctor if you were sick? Did you feel like you were not loved or cared for? Were you often hungry? Did you live in a household where your parents were separated or divorced, or where somebody had major mental illness? Did you live in a household where somebody was incarcerated? There's very specific questions it asks. And if you score a 6 or higher on an ACE score, you're going to die 20 years earlier. If you score a 4 or higher on an ACE score, you're going to have a much higher rate of heart attacks, asthma, emphysema, multiple broken bones. Crazy, right? Like, that seems crazy that I'm describing chronic conditions. I'm describing taking 20 years off your life based on growing up in chaos and trauma. But guess what? The impact of childhood trauma on the development, not just of your brain, but of every organ in your body, is huge. And what we don't know about this is 1,000 times more than what we know about this. In the next 20 or 30 years in the country, we're going to be studying this more and more. And if one of the things we can do as adults is to protect our kids, and when I say our kids, I mean all of our kids in our schools, our kids at DCF, you could predict that DCF kids have high trauma scores. You could just predict this, right? And if you guys were the public health planners of society, you would be putting every resource possible to our kids who are in the DCF system, right? Kids who are children of people who struggle with addiction, you already just calculated up at least 2 ACE scores in your head. You know who knows ACE scores? School counselors know ACE scores. School teachers know ACE scores. School nurses know ACE scores. They don't know them because a kid filled out the form. We don't take these surveys of kids, but we're constantly adding up the numbers in our heads of who is too high risk, who do we need to get more services to. You know what a kid with a high ACE score or a high trauma score looks like in a classroom? They're impulsive, they tend to have outbursts, they tend to have a poor attention span, they tend to be highly distractible. What does that sound like? Exactly right. It sounds like ADHD. It gets diagnosed like ADHD, except, and then we give them stimulants, which is crazy. We overdiagnose ADHD. We just do. 5% of us may have ADHD. I've been in school districts where like 30% of the kids are on stimulants, right? That's insane, right? And those are like, I don't know what they are, high-performance school districts where the parents think everybody needs to get into an Ivy League or whatever, because the drugs don't work that way. But when you misdiagnose a kid who actually has trauma, as ADHD, you've just now not gotten them the treatment they really needed, right? Because trauma treatment and building a trauma network of who out there is really good at treating childhood trauma really matters. You know who knows who's at trauma? Police, because police are often the first on the scene for trauma. And having a rapid response system that actually meets that kid's need is really important. And we're years away from that, but a community like this that is really smart and engaged with big youth prevention, thinking that level of prevention is very doable. So that's what I'm going to say, and I'm going to show you a book at the end that's going to tell you more about this subject, okay? Okay, so I'm skipping. Okay, 3 things: genetics, trauma, and early use. You do not need all 3. Sadly, you probably need 1. And the message to your kids in your classroom, if you're a teacher, is delay your use. Talk to your kids and just delay your use as long as possible, especially if you're at high risk. So when I take care of my own, not my personal kids, but my kids, I take care of my office. And I have a 13-year-old sitting in front of me. And I'm a family doctor. I live in the middle of nowhere. I know everybody, right? So I take care of her dad at the jail. I take care of her mom who has struggled with addiction. And now I have the 13-year-old in front of me. And I look at her in the eyeball and I'm like, love, things have not been easy for you at home. And I know that, and you know that too. And you and I both know that you're at much higher risk of developing addiction because of your genetic risk, right? I'm not telling her something she doesn't know. You think our kids don't know everything they do. This is the thing that you need to prevent, and you can prevent this, but let's practice right now. Let's, the 2 of us, right now, practice what you're going to say when somebody offers you that first cigarette, that first vape product, that first bowl of weed. Let's practice what you're going to say, because it needs to come out of your mouth before you even knew that you said no, right? Because you're the kid who has to walk away harder and more fiercely than anybody else. And that's why you talk to your kids about this, is because they get to control the outcome. How extraordinary is that? Okay, our kids, awesome decisions. Lowest rates of alcohol use. They're going to eradicate paper cigarettes. The illicit drugs is flat because of pot, right? It's not flat because they're using more opiates. They just actually aren't. This is just the increasing rates of marijuana. But this is the problem. Ready? I told you a long time ago that I'm going to tell you this thing that's the opposite of what I said about cigarettes. E-cigarettes and vaping has exploded. And everybody knows this in the room, right? Because I just saw this sort of like collective, right? E-cigarettes vaping have been around for a while now, 8 years, 10 years, but they were pretty quiet. We would collect stuff in schools a bit, maybe once a week or so, but something happened in every school district I've ever been to in the last 9 to 10 to 12 months. Something flipped. And who's in the school now, in this school, or whatever school? Have you guys been picking up tons of vape trends in school? No?
Not yet.
Not yet, really? Some said yes. So do you work in the school?
No,
No.
but I live in Avon, and it's really good.
It's really big. Huge. Do I have a school resource officer in the room? No. Do you?
Little kids, so.
Little kids, okay. Middle school, not so much? Okay. I was in, not to tell tales, on one of those darn rich suburbs, south, way south of here. But I was in one of those big, rich suburbs and whatever that, what's your most southern county? It's where Greenwich is. Fairfield. I was in Fairfield County. That's as much as I'll tell you. And the 6th grade class in this very rich Fairfield County town, half the kids had been suspended for vaping. Half of the 6th grade class, right? So I'm a little surprised and delighted for the minute it hasn't hit Windsor yet, but I'm telling you, I don't know why, because every school district I've been in, they have picked up more in a single day of e-cigarettes and vape things than they picked up all of last year. If somebody went back, and you smart IT kids here, went back into the IT forensics, something went viral about 10 months ago, right? Probably 5 things went viral. And it went to every social media account that our kids check, and it must have been unbelievably cool. Right? It was somebody doing this vaping tricks. Yeah.
So what are the schools doing about it? Like you just said they just, suspended these kids. I'll tell you
Right.
what they do in Avon, you get a ticket.
Yeah, no, so schools do lots of different things. You can't suspend the entire, so let me talk a little bit about what we're even talking about, because it could be that some people in the room aren't even as far along as you and I are thinking about this, and then we'll talk about what some schools do. So this is the thing. This data is wicked old now. It's from 2017. It's actually useless because something shifted in 2018 school year. But by senior year, about 1/3 of seniors have vaped in the last 30 days. And when you ask kids, what do you think you're vaping, what might they say? Can I ask my kids in the room, what are you vaping? Not you necessarily, but other kids, what are they vaping? What is in it?
They say water.
Water. It's water vapor and some flavor, right? That's what my kid said. My 13-year-old said, Mom, you are so crazy. It's just water vapor and flavor. Get over it. And I'm like, no, not so much. That isn't what's in there, right? So this is the problem. That's what they think is in there. But instead, there's actually several preservatives that, when heated, are actually cancer-causing. We know nothing about them because nobody studied them. But more important to me, because that's something that's going to take decades to sort out, is that there's nicotine in it, even though it says there's no nicotine in it. So this is a study that came out about 2 months ago, and it collected 70 American-made e-juices, the stuff you refill things with, all of which were labeled 0 milligrams of nicotine. Then it brought it to the lab to test it for nicotine. What percent of it had nicotine in it?
100%.
Tiny bit lower. 90% of the 0 milligram nicotine products had nicotine in it. Some of which had the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes. All labeled 0 milligrams of nicotine. You know what? They're lying to you. They're lying to you and to you, right? You know why they're lying to you? It's because you guys are saying no to the tobacco industry. And the tobacco industry is backdooring you guys in, right? They're going to make nicotine addicts out of every kid who thinks they're just smoking vapor, because there is no one regulating this industry, right? So here's the FDA, 3 weeks ago came out saying, you know what, this e-juice seems like a problem because it looks like they're kind of targeting our kids. So everything on the left pictures, that little apple juice is e-juice. It looks just like apple juice. That Ready Whip can on the right is real Ready Whip. The one on the left is the e-juice version of Ready Whip, right? And then the bottom one is your Nilla wafer, right? This is the stuff you're filling up. You think a truck driver trying to stop smoking is buying a Ready Whip version, right? This is intended for your kids, period. And if you look at most of this industry, it's intended to target your kids. So the FDA sent out letters to these guys being like, oh, no, you can't be actually making this product. You need to stop. But this is the first time we've heard from the federal government on this product line at all. The Juul cigarettes don't lie. They say, hi, we're full of nicotine. And these are the cool ones because they're slick. They're a little bit like the iPhone. They have that like cool high-tech slickness. They're metal and they charge with that little USB port into your Chromebook in class. You can vape during English class and no one knows what you're doing. It is tiny, You blow it into your hoodie or into your bag, no one knows. You are vaping not just nicotine in class, but you could fill these things up with THC. I had a school resource officer show me the e-cartridges that were 97% THC. Now, was it really? I had no clue, right? Because none of this stuff is labeled. But if I have a kid who's just getting high on weed in the back of English class, regardless of what they might have said about improving school performance, you cannot convince me that is improving anybody's school performance, right? So here I have, and this thing is so cool because if your teacher's walking by, you flip it like this, it's metal, it's magnetic, and it just zips down and is now underneath your metal desk. You hide it inside the toilet paper rolls in stall 3 in the bathroom, and your friends know stall 3 has it, and they can go vape during class. Nobody knows. Why would they know? And this thing is changing all the time, and is way ahead of us in terms of how it looks. So here I have an industry that is intentionally trying to addict our kids, period. It just is. And what are our schools doing about it? So schools are doing a variety of things. If you are one of the kids who buys the big e-juice refillers and you're paying $5 to everybody to refill it, you're suspended. You're probably actually worse than suspended because you're actually dealing in illicit drug. You're not allowed to have nicotine products, including any of this stuff on school grounds. Everybody knows this. They know it, but they're going to do it anyway. If you're an 8th grader who's just found with it, in my world, you would be really have a strong education. This would be a talk that one of you could deliver. Because I actually find when kids realize they're getting lied to, it actually kind of ticks them off. Kids don't like to be lied to. They don't. They want to be told because they want to know their truth, which is that this generation is making the best decisions. And to go from making the best decisions to getting backdoored by the nicotine industry, I think that makes them feel bad. So we need more actually of our kids, our young people, to design sort of the anti-e-cigarette, anti-vape curriculum that you go out to the middle schools and deliver. You guys can do that. Okay, I'm going to just skip this. Let's talk about opiates for a second, because I think everybody knows we're smack dab in the middle of a horrible epidemic. So I live up I-91. I'm the last exit at I-91 in Massachusetts. That's where I live. And so your world, my I-91 world, we all live in the same corridor. And every morning I get up and I do the exact same thing. I get up, I read the newspaper, I read the obituaries. In the morning of December of 2012, I read the obituary of the young woman in the red jacket on the upper left. And it read, Ashley Sims, age 21, died of a heroin overdose at home. It was 2012, a million years ago. And I remember reading that obituary and feeling sick. And thinking, I know her grandmothers who raised her, and I called them to tell them how heartbroken I was, but also to thank them for telling the truth about how Ashley had died, because it was the first time that I'd read an obituary that actually told us why a young person would die unexpectedly at home. But for years in advance of that, I'd been reading obituaries of young people dying unexpectedly at home. And unless the bottom says, please give money to the Lymphoma Leukemia Society, unexpected deaths at home in young people is either suicide or an overdose these days. That's what most of us are seeing. So these grandmothers went to our little tiny local Greenfield recorder, the smallest, most rural, poorest county in Massachusetts, and said, you must start telling the story about what opiates are doing to our town, and our county is destroying us. And the front page of the Greenfield Recorder began to run stories every single day on this subject. And Greenfield, Mass. and Franklin County are considered the leaders in the state of Massachusetts. Were considered actually one of the leaders in the entire country when it comes to the opiate epidemic. CNN was out interviewing us 2 weeks ago. There was a great article that came out saying, does Greenfield, Massachusetts have the solution to the opiate epidemic? This is a town of 15,000 people, right? A tiny little county. But it's often actually changes that single individuals make that can shift this sort of thing. And it was these two grandmothers and Ashley's death that began to change the story for us. There's no doubt in my mind that pills are on the hook for this epidemic. The overprescribing of pills over the last 20 years created this problem. When you look at our country compared to every other country in the nation, that dark blue line is us. We prescribe more opiates than every other country in the world. There's no way we have more pain than Canada. We are Canadian by and large. Like, how are we any different, right? We have the same medical problems. They prescribe far fewer, but it makes no sense that we prescribe so many. At this point, there are more people dying of death by opiate overdoses than motor vehicle accidents, than death by gun violence, than death by AIDS, at the peak of the AIDS epidemic. It's the #1 cause of death under the age of 50, is death by opiate overdose. And this used to be sort of, I think there's been this huge, very positive shift in thinking that back when this felt like an urban black problem, nobody cared, and then white kids got involved, and all of a sudden people started to care. The demographics are shifting even faster now, and the most recent data I saw 2 weeks ago are now saying that this is still like a white, rural, urban problem, but now, guess what, it's hooking everybody. Latinos are getting hooked at much higher rates, and the death rate, the highest spike in death rate is now with Latino men and women. So this disease knows no racial bounds or no socioeconomic bounds, and it feels to me like it's just going to come after every one of us someday. This is what the nation looked like. That map, it goes as 2003, and it marches itself along all the way to 2014. Those red areas are places where people are dying from overdose from drugs. And the problem is we don't start to see China-made fentanyl arrive in the country till about 2015. And that's when the map really explodes, because prescription opiates will get you addicted. Sometimes they'll kill you. What really kills people is heroin and fentanyl. And if we spend all of our time talking about the pills, we're actually not talking about the drug that's actually killing people. So most of the pills that came to New England came from the fine state of Florida. And they would, we knew, I used to call I-95 Oxy Highway. And it really started getting distributed in the late 90s all the way up to about 2010. And there would be this whole industry, tour buses going down to Florida from all over the place on the eastern seaboard. All your hotels were paid for, all your meals were paid for, and your job was to walk into 2 pill mills a day. All you needed was a stack of cash. You didn't even need a limp diagnosis. You could be a young person like you. You walked out with a bag of pills and a stack of scripts. Your tour operator brought it back to Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Maine, and Kentucky. And that's the way it worked for 10 solid years. In the year 2009, the federal government said to the state of Florida, if you cannot get control over your crazy state, we're going to cut off federal funding. No highway funds, no education funds. Your state is destroying the eastern seaboard. 2010, the DEA moved into the state of Florida, and they closed down nearly every one of the 600 pill mills in Florida. They sent 34 American-trained doctors to prison, and they're still in prison because they weren't doctors of any sort. They were drug dealers. So the problem is I've just closed down the entire pipeline of pills, and I have, I don't know, a couple, 3 million Americans addicted to opiates up and down I-95. What am I left with? Yeah, I'm left with heroin. I'm left with an unbelievably cheap, pure, deadly drug. It's the unintended consequences of having done the right thing, is we actually replaced a bad addictive substance with an even worse addictive substance that kills people at a much higher rate. We weren't ready for this. We weren't prepared for how fast this moved. So that bottom map is prior to the shutdown of Florida, and those red states are places where overdoses were high. Of the second map on top is 2010 to 2015, so that's post-Florida shutdown, and you see the overdose rates hike, right? And again, don't get me wrong, I wanted Florida shut down, right? But this is unintended consequences of a good move. When you look at the nation county by county, I love maps, I can show you guys maps all day, but this is a county by county breakdown of the entire country, and those dark counties are counties where there is on average between 1 and 1.5 bottles of opiate per man, woman, and child in that county. So there remains part of this country where there's a huge continued prescription of opiates, right? Huge. And the problem is, in the next 6 months, the next 12 months, as the FDA, CDC, DEA, and Medicare and Medicaid really put the hammer down on prescribing. When Medicare and Medicaid, which we think they're going to do in January of 2019, says you can't prescribe an opiate for longer than, I don't know, 2 weeks, they're going to come up with some rule, those counties are going to get shut down. And those are counties where there's a large amount of addiction. And those are counties that will convert to heroin, period. They just will. And look at the distribution of where those counties are, right? You think those are counties where patrol cars are carrying Narcan, or where they're having forums like this at night talking about addiction? You think they're building methadone clinics in those places, training doctors out of medical school to use buprenorphine? You think any of that's happening? The prediction is that we will have 500,000 people die of opiate overdose in the next 5 years. Huge numbers, insane numbers, something that we haven't seen. And that's not, remember, I'm a positive person. I may have low dopamine, but I'm a positive person. I'm not being negative on this. I just think we have to be prepared. We should know this going into this. How do our kids get opiates? In general, That sign in your hallway and in the bathroom that I saw is the way our kids used to get opiates. They got them from us. They got them from our medicine cabinet because we had knee surgery 7 years ago and we held out to our bottle of Vicodin and left it in a medicine cabinet. Those days are gone. And if you think in the back of your head, I got an old bottle of Xanax and an old bottle of some Ritalin and something hanging around, still at your house, quite honestly, shame on you. It doesn't belong there. We're done with that. That, again, old conversation, 2012 conversation. This state has really gotten a little bit better about making sure that there's drug collection. You guys have drug take-back boxes in Windsor, but not every town in Connecticut does. You guys are actually ahead of the game. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm looking at Sarah here, but my guess is maybe only half the towns in Connecticut have drug take-back. I would love to actually know. Connecticut's running behind on this, is what I will say. But you're not as... What was that? Avon doesn't, okay? And you know what, guys? That room that I walked through on the way here was a senior center. Lovely, lovely older people. If we went through their medicine cabinets, you know what they had? A ton of drugs. They just do. Because it's hard when you're a senior and you're confused. You never understood what the medicine was to begin with. You can't even read the label. It's probably been rubbed off because it's 10 years old. And who's going to collect their meds, right? Like, this takes a public health response. That's what it takes. So their states are way behind Connecticut, I'll say that much. But I don't ever want Connecticut to be behind. I want this state to be leading the effort. So getting the drugs out of your house is step number one. You do not want to be the house where kids get medicine from, period. And if you yourself use a medicine, a prescription opiate, a prescription stimulant, it should be under lock and key, right? Along with my liquor, under lock and key. Okay, so how do our kids get it? They get it prescribed to them, right? They're athletes, they break their femur on the football team, they get their wisdom teeth out, and they're given a prescription. And what you need to do as a parent is to look at the prescriber and say, look, I know that you're going to treat my kid for pain, but I need you to tell me how to manage my kid's pain without exposing them to opiates, or to as little as possible. So talk me through it. What's my pain management strategy to keep my kids safe away from opiates? And if that doctor sputters and stammers and is like, I don't know, you're going to find a new doctor as far as I'm concerned. But if they stutter and stammer and then come up with a pretty good plan, that's okay. It could be that nobody's asked them this before, my friends, right? Medicine doesn't change fast. So when I take care of a kid who's been injured, I'm like, ibuprofen and Tylenol used in conjunction, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to use distraction, and then we're going to use heat, and then I'm going to have you call this person who's an acupuncturist that you know in your town. I live in like the Crunchy Valley where like I got like somatic healers left and right. But my point is, you can make an approach for plan A and plan B, and plan C is very judicious, parent-controlled of an opiate if needed. So let me just ask the room, who had oral surgery this year of any sort, root canal or wisdom teeth? Okay, let me ask you, what were you prescribed? Was it a prescription opiate, do you think? Was it Vicodin?
Yeah,
Okay, maybe Vicodin, hydrocodone. And do you remember how many you were given?
12.
12, okay, 12. Can I ask you what you were given?
Just Advil, just suggested Advil.
Just suggested Advil. Had oral surgery, and actually the doctor suggested, didn't even offer you a prescription for an opiate. So this right here has changed. This is 12, and that was 0. Okay, let's go back in time. Who had maybe wisdom teeth, root canal 5, 6 years ago? What did you get?
I had shoulder and elbow surgery all at the same time.
And what did they give you?
They gave me 2 Dilaudid, and then because I have nausea, would take those, I took Tylenol.
Okay, so you were given actually not much, and you chose to avoid it. Does anybody have a different story than that? Yeah.
I have a little different story. I think it was 2007. I went for some type of hernia repair. Or it wasn't even that, for something else. And she said, do you want something for pain? And I thought she was going to give me some type of topical lidocaine. And I said, oh, like what? And she said, something like Vicodin or something, or whatever. And I said, no. If I need that, I will call.
Right. So this is a room that knew to say no, is what I would say. That's pretty darn impressive. But if you didn't have that level of health literacy, or you just were just sort of clueless, because why would anybody know if the doctor says, take this medicine? Most of us are like, okay, right? But what you're hearing me say to you is that we're now living in a shifting world where people are prescribing less. They are. But the truth is that maybe the American Dental Association, which came out 6 weeks ago saying, you know what, maybe we should never ever be prescribing opiates, ever, right? Maybe that should be the new rule. That was the national ADA saying that. That just came out. So when I ask people, when you had your wisdom teeth out, how many opiates did you use? The answer is always 0, 2, 4. The most I've ever heard in a public setting was 6. So that's really the limit of where anybody should prescribe for wisdom teeth or root canal, is that few, right? I think it's weird for a doctor to write a script for 4 pills. I do it all the time. But my point is, your job as an adult is to protect your kid's brain, and you want to limit their exposure. If your kid has cancer, and they're in pain, you're going to give them an opiate, period. You're not going to ask any questions. Of course, you're going to ask questions, and you're going to do other alternative things. But you're not going to let your kid with metastatic bone cancer suffer. That will not happen, right? So, but I'm just talking about normal pain, which most of us can get through. Okay, so if you love somebody who struggles with addiction, you should have Narcan. You should be able to use naloxone, because Good Samaritan laws apply in the state of Connecticut, and you can walk into any pharmacy in Connecticut without a prescription and get this. I shouldn't say any, actually. I think it's just the big chains in Connecticut. Definitely Walgreens and definitely CVS. I can't speak for the little family pharmacies. It's a law in Massachusetts. Every pharmacy has to have it. You walk in without a prescription, it runs under your prescription. So if you're a medical person, and if somebody goes down in a room and you're the first one they're going to look at because you're in medicine, I'm telling you, you think you're going to revive somebody with an overdose with your basic CPR? Not so much. You still do CPR and you call 911. Narcan, most medical people should have it. I have it in my bag. And this website called Get Naloxone Now will tell you how to identify an overdose, how to use the drug. It's like Flonase. It's like a little squirt that goes in the nose. It's no big deal. People get better with addiction. There are people in this room in recovery. People get better. It is not easy. It is a long path. It takes many, many steps on this long journey. And it isn't one thing that fixes you. It's about 10 things or 29 things. It's a lot. On everybody's giant pie of recovery, there has to be one piece that has to be focused on sober housing. You cannot go back to a place where somebody was drinking or using and think you're going to get better. You're not going to make it. You're just not. When they tell me that, I'm sitting in the room, they're like, no, I'm just going back home. I'm like, you're not going to get better there. And you may want to go home. I get that. You may not want to go to the next step in another program. But there's nothing you're telling me about your story that is not going to have you return to the old behaviors. Because of the way the brain works, you're just going to recycle back in. So I believe in AA, I believe in mental health work, I believe in every medical assisted treatment out there, whether it's methadone or Suboxone or naltrexone. I will do anything it takes to help people get some traction with their sobriety. I do not judge any path. I'm open to all of it. My jail is the only jail in Massachusetts that uses MAT in our jail, our correctional facility. Connecticut actually has a couple jails that have done this. You guys have actually led the way in some ways, but it has not been universal. I'm sorry, MAT stands for medical treatment for addiction. So methadone, Suboxone, also called buprenorphine, and naltrexone. So they're considered the best evidence-based treatments for addiction to opiates. It's a little harder to treat alcohol use disorder, but some good meds with that too. But that's what MAT stands for. Sorry, I should not have used that. These are great books on addiction. Any one of these books. If you were never going to open the slide set that Sarah sent you, this is a good picture to take with your smartphone. Because if you thought tonight was vaguely interesting, you thought, you know what, I should know more, I want to learn more, any one of these books is awesome. That top middle book called The Body Keeps the Score is the best book on trauma I've ever read in my life. And for those of you who take care of kids, who take care of adults, who just are in a caring profession, including a uniformed officer, because you guys actually face and actually have a lot of secondary trauma yourselves, that is an amazing book. It's really well written. It's the one book that is on my husband's bedside table and my bedside table, and we actually keep returning to it. The book called Dreamland is the book on the distribution of heroin around our country. It is high tech. It involves Uber and Lyft and regional airports and UPS and the U.S. Postal Service. And building a wall between us and Mexico is not going to change the amount of heroin in our country. This is way beyond that. This is largely nonviolent. And if I texted somebody, I could have 50 bags of dope in our lobby in 4 minutes, because that's the way it rolls. So that book talks about how it was distributed. It's distressing, but it's really good. There's none of these books that are not excellent. Who's read any of these books? Anybody? Has anybody read the book called Beautiful Boy? Beautifully written by a journalist about his son Nick, who really has terrible, terrible addiction. And the whole time you just think Nick's not going to make it. Nick makes it, but it's horrible. It's heartbreaking as a parent. Fabulous book to read, okay? So I have a website. It's my name, ruthpotee.com. And on this website are articles that I've read. I post new articles. I posted an article 2 days ago. Anything I read that I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting take. That's interesting. They're thinking about this differently. I post it on the website. I have videos like this video of me. I just keep posting the videos if they're up there. I change my talks all the time. I constantly am updating slides or thinking about things differently or adding or taking away stuff. So But the talk is often the same, and when you guys go give your talk somewhere else and you want to rehearse it, just go to one of the videos, watch it one more time, make sure you have your shtick down before you go take on the middle school one day. Because seriously, this work is the other work that people can be doing. It doesn't have to be me at all. This is stuff, curriculum that can be embedded in a middle school or high school health class, a neuroscience class, a Sunday school class. Lots of people deserve to know it. Okay, what questions do people have? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the money flow in the vaping industry? If you want to follow the money, where does it lead?
So this question is really interesting, and I may not know all the answers on this one. The money flow of vaping, where's it really coming from? So 90% of the market is actually China-made products. China, not everything's made from China. Everything we're all wearing, right? So but I'm talking actually China companies. So a lot of the money is going to Chinese companies, okay? There's now a smaller percentage of American-made products out there, but most of it seems to be funded deep under by the tobacco industry. So at the end of the day, if this generation is going to get rid of Joe Camel and the Marlboro Man, that tobacco industry has got to be making money. Now, what have they really been doing? They've been targeting people of color in other countries, right? The rates of smoking in Vietnam are still through the roof, right? And so they're targeting other countries who are poor, and we're addicting them, but they're still looking for how they can target our country and our kids. So at the end of the day, way deep back, most of it's the tobacco industry. The China element to the story is not just on the vaping front, it's kind of an interesting story. People will say to me, if you were a drug dealer, why do you want to kill your clients? Like, walk me through the economics of that. Why would you want to put fentanyl in your product and actually kill your client who's bringing you money, right? So it's a complicated answer to that because you're selling a better product. It's more potent, the high is better, except it can kill you. So you actually probably expand your market a little bit because the word gets out, right? And I actually think most drug dealers don't care if they lose a few people today. It's not, what do they care? There's some argument on the China front, because everything we know about fentanyl is not the Duragesic patch. It's not the patch that your great-grandmother who had cancer had stuck to her arm. That is not where fentanyl is coming from. Fentanyl is being manufactured in labs in China. And it's getting shipped here by UPS or whomever is delivering, and it takes 1 or 2 grains of fentanyl, grains, tiny amounts to kill you. So who cares if the DEA confiscates 90% of it? I just need to ship in 10%, right? And I can actually probably kill all of New England. There's some pushback saying that this is China's response to the opium wars 120 years ago. I mean, what do they care, quite honestly, right? If you want to really take out, you want to fell your economic opponent, start killing us off, right? Get a whole bunch of us addicted to fentanyl. That's what we did to them during the opium wars. Now, that's incredibly cynical. I doubt the Chinese government is sitting down around a conference table talking about it. But like any big industry, if they really wanted to shut down the labs, they probably could, right? And it's clearly not happening. Somebody had a question. Yes?
Can you say something more about maybe medicines or medications that are being prescribed for like ADHD or anxiety and the effects they have on people?
Yep. Okay, so this is 100% of the time this question gets asked because it's a really critical question. This is what we know. 5% of us have ADHD, and making that diagnosis is really important to make it well. Because if your kid truly has ADHD, you really want everything possible going to your kid. You need an IEP, you need that kid's classroom to change, you need every one of the teachers to understand this, you need different testing environment, you need every possible thing coming your kid's way, okay? I live in a crunchy granola part of the world where they're like, I'm going to give some Chinese herbs to my kid. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to kill this mom. Because when you have true ADHD and you're 9 years old and you cannot help yourself, you're interrupting everybody, you're like considered both the class clown and also the class irritant. In your room, you have no friends, you are not popular, and you're failing. And those kids are suffering hugely. And when I start them on a low-dose stimulant and their life gets better, and I don't care about their grades, it's not for me about classroom performance, it's about societal performance. Those kids come back to me and they're like, look, you know, I'm not such a jerk in class. They don't mean to be that way, right? They can't help it. They cannot help the fact, this lack of impulse control, just they have them talking over their friends. So I'm often urging parents of kids who truly have the diagnosis of ADHD to actually accept all the treatments we have coming from them, including the medicine, okay? Now, I said earlier, we overdiagnose it, we overtreat it, and I think when you get kids who don't belong on stimulants because they don't have the diagnosis on stimulants, that's not actually good for their brains. It's just not. And what's the number one drug that's getting traded in college? Stimulants, right? So just because you think you need to do really well on your law test, you're going to take an Adderall in the parking lot, right? That's not good decision making, and you're probably exposing your brain to an addictive substance that's not good for it. And there's very good evidence saying these are not performance enhancing drugs. Kids who take these things do better on their test. They think they do better, right? They have the sense of I was all powerful and I was speedier, but their test scores aren't any better, right? So this is the problem. Here's the rub. When you look at people who struggle with addiction, adults struggling with addiction, about a third of them have ADHD. But that's a big number. Here I am saying only 5% of us have ADHD, but once you get to be an adult, a third of them actually carry that diagnosis as a kid. Then you ask yourself, which came first, right? Did the ADHD create addiction, or did the exposure to the stimulant create addiction? It's complicated. What I say is having poor impulse control in general makes you much more likely to struggle with drug abuse, because you're the kid, the person, the adult, the 21-year-old, the 26-year-old who's like, yes, oh yeah, I'll do that. No, it seems like a really good idea. I'm in. That's your brain. That's your brain with ADD, right? And so you're just much more likely to use. What I find when I take care of adults who struggle with addiction, who have ADHD, diagnosed as a child, under the age of 12, meeting all the criteria, if I treat their ADHD, they do better, right? So I make sure it's a real diagnosis that they had as a kid, they meet adult qualifications. When I quiet down that brain that is all yes, all brake, all accelerator, no brake, they get their addiction under control. So I do not think that ADHD drugs cause addiction when prescribed appropriately. I do think there's a very high prevalence of ADHD amongst people who struggle with addiction, and it's not causative, but it's correlative. Very complicated answer, because it's a complicated question. Yes?
So speaking about ADHD, so my son was diagnosed in 4th grade.
Yep.
ADHD focused subject, okay? So he was put on Ritalin, and he's actually in 9th grade right now, and he's actually one of those success stories in a sense, because we did everything that you said.
Yep. And he's doing well.
Unbelievable.
Is he off his meds or on his meds?
Oh, he's on his meds.
Yeah.
If he's not on his meds, he's a different kid.
Yeah. No, because
But
kids
he
with
did
ADHD...
therapy,
Yeah, you did everything right. But let's
be
be clear, you had resources. You had a school district that helped you. You had IEPs that got performed. You're an
But
enabler.
I had a master's social worker. I knew what I was doing.
Yeah.
I worked for DCF.
Right.
You know, I did what I needed.
You can imagine all kinds of families who didn't have your knowledge and
Yeah.
resources who weren't able to actualize that. So your kid is not at higher rates of anything.
No.
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
Yeah. So you hear both things.
You
know?
hear both things. No,
You
I
hear
am-
a lot more than negative, I think.
Yeah, I am very positive on treating, but you got to diagnose it right. I didn't answer your question on anxiety and depression. I meant to. So anxiety and depressant medicines that we use in teenagers are the following in general. They're SSRIs or SNRIs. So they work with the serotonin system, right? And they're not interacting with the dopamine system. Sometimes they actually work with the norepinephrine system. They're not addictive drugs, actually. They're not addictive. They change your brain chemistry because they're increasing the amount of serotonin and norepinephrine available. Those are sort of things that make your mood better. Can kids have a hard time getting off of them? Yeah, they can. We have to wean you off of them. Not because they're addictive, but because they create some dependency. The dependency and addiction are different, okay? Now, if you are a 14-year-old kid who struggles with severe anxiety and the prescriber said, let's give you some Valium or some Ativan or some Klonopin, benzos, those are addictive drugs, period, right? And I would look at that doctor in the eye and be like, oh my God, we're leaving your office. Now, no one should be prescribing benzos to a kid, period. It's one thing to say, I have to put my kid into an MRI machine for the next 47 minutes where they have to be frozen in place and they're going to have a panic attack. That is an appropriate use of a low-dose benzo, one-time use. But continuous use of that class of medicine, those are addictive drugs. In general, should not be prescribed to kids, and I think that they're not. I don't know what everybody does. I know what my practices do, okay? So if you have a kid with anxiety or depression, the first treatment is always therapy. Therapy 100 times over is the most effective treatment. The second most effective treatment is exercise, tons of physical movement. And third, and it's not a distant third, but for me it can be a distant third, is meds. And so when I sit with my 14-year-olds, and I'm pushing the parents on this stuff, tons of exercise, tons of really good therapy, and the meds are my third line. But I'm going to say to you, not addressing your kid's anxiety and depression is one of the worst things you can do, because they will find a way to self-medicate. So we got to pay attention to that. So that is my answer to that, okay? Is that, I'm sorry, I didn't need to skip that. Okay, yes?
Can you remind me again what serotonin is?
So serotonin is like dopamine. It's one of the other neurotransmitters in the brain. And on my second slide, I showed you the brain. It had a blue part that was dopamine, and it had a red part that was serotonin. Serotonin goes through a different part of the brain, and it gives us most, it's not a happiness. For those, I've had depression before, I've been on meds before. They are not happy pills, they just lift the heavy cloud. That's all it does. And if they don't work perfectly, there's some studies that show that that class of drugs may not work much better than placebo. But for some of us, they work well enough that they make a difference, right? Placebo works really well too. I wish it were legal for me to give you guys a sugar pill, because all of us on a placebo get 30% better just by swallowing a pill, right? So it's not legal for me to do that. So there's a benefit just to feel like somebody heard me today, and now I'm taking something to make myself better. There's a bump in how you are in general. What other questions do people have? Yeah.
You have ADHD and you have ADD.
Right, they're different from each other, yeah.
Right. ADD, do you feel can be better controlled through brain training as opposed to medicating?
I guess I'm not going to give you a strong response on that one. I don't know. I am a person who believes every person is different, and that as you and me, as parents, we got to look at our kid and we want to do everything we can to support them. And if there are entities out there that you often have to pay a lot of money that will do the brain training work, and if it makes a difference for your kid, I'm all in favor of that. What I don't like to see is I don't like kids to suffer because their parents are so stuck on no meds, no meds, no meds. Because when I'm sitting in that room in that situation and I look at that kid on my table and I'm like, how do you feel? The kid often is bursting into tears saying, I was better when I was on the medicine, right? I had friends. I wasn't such a jerk all the time. They don't always use that language, but that's what they're expressing to me. Sometimes they say the opposite. Sometimes they say, I don't like being on the meds. I miss being the class clown. I was funnier when I had ADHD. And I'm like, I hear that. I know that, right? And sometimes they would choose. I've had plenty, particularly as teenagers, say I would rather be the class clown and not get my homework done and not hand any of my assignments and be a C- kid. That's just who I want to be. I can't force them to take their meds, and their parents really can't force them either. And so it's a hard choice sometimes because, one of the things I will say about antidepressants, right? They will decrease the lows. Sometimes some of the meds will decrease the highs, but a lot of us will say they flatten us out emotionally. Maybe that doesn't feel good. It's complicated. So maybe let me do one more question, if that's okay. And again, everybody who signed up on that board, Sarah's going to email you a very big Google Doc. It may take a while for you to download it, okay? Yeah.
I guess it's a comment, and I don't mean any disrespect to the whole opioid epidemic at all, but there's so much focus on that, but there's so many other things like marijuana, Xanax, other addictions that our teens and young ones are facing. I don't know, I get frustrated with it, I guess, because I think a lot of times people go, oh, well, my kids aren't using opiates.
I know.
Heroin.
So tonight, how much time did I spend on opiates versus the other things? It was like 10% of my talk, wasn't it? And I would argue, people think I'm going to stand here and talk about opiates. I came here to help you guys think about the stuff that you're worried about, because that's what I'm worried about too, right? Most kids are not using heroin. They just aren't. They are not. Now, some are, but most are not. Most of our kids, at this point, are exposing their brains to this crazy vape product and getting hooked on nicotine, or they're using marijuana. And they're using it to self-medicate, and they're using it because they think it helps their performance. It treats my anxiety, it helps my insomnia, I'm better when I'm on it, and everybody does it, right? It's normalized. That's the problem. It really has become normalized where we're going to be driving by blocks, and we're going to see store after store after store, and then it just becomes part of everybody's normal day, right? This is what, and then that may not be what we all wanted. It may not be what you thought your little town might look like. But it's our future. It really is. I hate to say, Connecticut I thought would be a holdout, but now I'm hearing about legislators in your fine state who are chasing the money. And the money side of the pot industry is tiny. The tax dollars in Connecticut go to the public schools. I'm sorry, what state teachers just went on strike? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say Connecticut, Colorado. Colorado teachers were on strike because you think that money is really going to support teachers in the schools? It isn't. It isn't. Every tax dollar in Massachusetts will be basically paying for the regulation of the industry. And in fact, we think we didn't even fund it enough. Because to regulate this thing takes a lot of work. It just does. People have to go inspect the grow sites. We have to inspect the stores. We have this whole commission with multiple staff people on it to manage the rules and regulations. That alone was $2 million in one tax year, right? We don't even have any revenue coming in yet. So the industry itself costs a lot of money, and the likelihood of you taxing it at a high enough rate that makes it better than the black market, there's a sweet spot for how much you can tax it. You tax too much and nobody's going to buy a product. They're going to just go to the black market, right? So the sweet spot is not enough to pay for it. So don't let anybody think that they're going to be, your little town is going to get money off of pot, right? You're going to think about my law enforcement back there. You know what we're going to have to do for increasing law enforcement? You know how easy it is to pull somebody over and tell that they're high when they're high, and you get that giant waft and they have actual marijuana in the car, you got a case. But otherwise, with no legal way of testing how much is in their system, you have a terribly impaired driver who's on our roads on I-91 right now, and our law enforcement has no way to manage that. It's not good for law enforcement. How are you feeling about the legalization of marijuana, can I ask you?
I'm not for it.
Yeah. So anyway, it's coming to you guys. My guess is within 5 years, Connecticut's going to vote. And call your legislators, talk to them about this. Again, if your job is to sell an addictive substance, you're going after your kids. That's your market, right? There's no, not conspiracy theory here. This is just the way the industry is designed. Hey, you guys have been an awesome audience. Thank you for having me here today.